Hi. Last time we spoke about the differences in political systems, legal systems, and economic systems. And different people may have different preferences. Somebody likes a free market economy, somebody likes a command economy, democracy, authoritarian regime. So every time we raise these questions, there is a heated debate. People are arguing and fighting. And so the only way to resolve this issue is to answer the question, what system is better? But then the question is, how do you answer this? How do you decide which system is better? Well, today we will talk about the ways to measure economic development, or not only economic development in general, not only economic development specifically, but the development of a nation, a success of a nation in general. So now that we know that there are different political, economic, and legal systems, how do we know, how do we measure how successful is one compared to another? Well, when I ask my students how they would measure different economic systems, they would often say, well, let's just look at wealth. Presumably the countries where people make more money are more effective, and the countries where people make less money are less effective. And so when I ask them, how would you measure wealth? In many cases, they say, well, let's look at, for example, GDP per capita, or maybe GNP per capita. It is a valid suggestion. Indeed, we can look at the economic development essentially here and see who makes most money. And you have a map here that shows how GDP per capita, so basically all of the product developed by a nation divided by the number of people, how that compares from one country to another. As you can see, the wealthiest nations are basically the oil-producing countries in the Middle East, like Saudi Arabia, like Qatar. The United States is on top of the list. Europe is slightly poorer in terms of the GDP per capita, but still does very well. And then, as many people would expect, Asia and Latin America are a little poorer. And then Africa is the least wealthy nation if you look at the GDP per capita. Now, GDP per capita is not a perfect measure, so it has all kinds of problems. I'm going to give you a second to think. What do you think, or why do you think GDP per capita or GNP per capita are not the best measures of economic development? And by the way, I assume you know the difference between GDP and GNP, right? Gross domestic product, GDP, that's all of the services, all of the goods that a nation produces within its borders. So for example, if we look at the United States, that would be all the factories, all of the restaurants, all of the companies located in the United States, whatever they produce, that's the gross domestic product. GNP is that gross national product. This one includes also the wealth generated by the nation overseas. So if an American company has a subsidiary somewhere, for example, in Germany, and makes some money in Germany, it still counts towards GNP. So if I ask you what is bigger, GNP or GDP, the answer would be what? Of course, it is GNP. GNP tends to be a little larger, but not by much. And some countries that are more engaged in international operations and trade, GNP will be larger than the GDP by a lot. For those that operate only domestically, it may be almost the same number. Anyway, so let me ask you again, why GDP per capita may not be the best way to measure the development of a nation, to compare it to nations and tell which one is more developed? Well, there are a bunch of problems with this approach, and we will talk about them one by one right now. So there is a difference in, for example, cost of living, right? So for example, the price of life is much greater in one country than in another. And so as a result, people who live in countries with high cost of living may be making a lot of money, but may not necessarily be able to buy much with that money because everything's expensive, right? So if somebody lives in a country where the cost of living is low, maybe that person doesn't make too much money, but at the same time, the person may be able to afford more. So it's not necessarily that people who live in countries with higher GDP per capita, they are wealthier if you measure that in the sense that how much they can afford, how much they can buy. Another problem is that the wealth may be not equally distributed among the people. Imagine a hypothetical scenario where you have a very, very rich country with a GDP per capita of, let's say, $1 trillion. And that country, let's say, has 1 million people. And let's assume that one person in this country owns all of the wealth. So he's a very, very rich person and he owns all of the wealth. And the other 999 people are very poor and have nothing. So in a sense, you would have a very high GDP per capita, but it would not be a very good life for the people in this country because they don't have anything. One very rich person owns all of the wealth. And then obviously when you look at GDP per capita, it is a combination of everything that the country produces. Police services, army, banking services, lawyers. So some of those services people would say do not necessarily contribute to the quality of life. Again, if you have a country that is at war and makes a lot of tanks and fights all the time and on all of the fronts, the GDP per capita will be huge, but at the same time, it's not like people can use that wealth to buy something they need. So people may be making a lot of products, but at the same time, it's not something they need for their life. And so they may not live very comfortably. Or maybe it's a country that is not very safe. And so people have to spend a lot on security, a lot on police. And so they may be spending millions and billions and trillions of dollars every year on the police because the life is so dangerous there that you have to spend on the police. And so in this case, police, the services that the police provides is still part of the GDP. Presumably it is a contribution to the economy. But at the same time, again, as you can imagine, it's not the most attractive country to live in. So from this perspective, it may not be necessarily a very developed nation, even though they work all day and all night policing the streets. But again, it's not necessarily a very good type of environment to be in. And I understand that this is a little difficult to understand, so let me explain it in a more simple terms. I will use an example of my grandfather. So here on the picture, you see my grandfather. He died some years ago. And he was born in 1905. And at that time, it was part of the Poland. Then shortly after, it became an independent country, Ukraine, and then part of the Soviet Union. And then since 1991, an independent country. And so he's seen a lot of different governments, and he's gone through a lot of different economic systems, from basically a free market system during the Polish times, then the command economy during the Soviet times, again, a free market economy, or sort of a mix of socialism and free market economy post-independence, Ukrainian independence. So he's seen enough. And so he lived in a country, Ukraine, which many would consider a poor country. So the GDP per capita of this country is fairly low. In fact, it's around $3,000 per year now, per capita. So not a lot at all. So according to this figure, people per month produce enough goods and services that are worth only about $300. In fact, more like $250. Not a lot. And so when you look at the GDP per capita of Ukraine, you may be under the impression that this country is basically extremely poor, that people there are not even 10% as wealthy as Americans. In fact, American GDP per capita is now over 50,000, close to almost 60. So you can say that Americans are, or it may create an impression that Americans have a quality of life that is 20 times better than that of Ukrainians. But this is true only at the first glance. When you look at Ukraine and its economy, you will see that the GDP per capita doesn't capture the entire development of the nation. So for example, when you look at my grandparents, right? So first of all, in Ukraine, there is a huge kind of shadow economy. So transactions that are not accounted, or at least not counted towards the GDP. So for example, they had about 2 acres of land. Almost always they would have 2 cows, sometimes some goats, 3 pigs, probably about 25 domestic birds. So they would never buy vegetables, they would never buy fruits, they would never buy eggs, milk. They basically produce it domestically. And that would save them probably about $1,500 annually, about $1,500 annually if you look at the prices. Obviously, that is not accounted in the GDP, but it is something they receive, that they produce and then they consume. In fact, sometimes they would have so much of certain product that they would even sell. My grandfather would sell, for example, cherries, I remember, sometimes some milk, sometimes apples. And so I don't know how much exactly they would make on that per year, but probably close to $500 a year. Then my grandfather was a carpenter. And so in smaller towns in Ukraine, most of the small towns would have like a carpenter, and then somebody would be a blacksmith, and then somebody would be a tailor. And so when people need either, a tool made by a carpenter, or maybe need a suit, made by a tailor, or get a haircut, they just go to the guy or a woman who specializes in that trade. So my grandfather was a carpenter. And a very illustrative example for me was when he died. It's a small town, so basically the whole town comes to the funeral. And at that time I was 20 something. And so my parents asked me to go door to door and ask neighbors for some chairs, because they wanted to have like a little memorial, dinner or something at reception, and there were not enough chairs in the house for the whole town to sit. So we had, I don't know, maybe 8 chairs in the house, and there would be probably, I don't know, close to 100 people who showed up for the funeral. And I was going literally door to door from one neighbor to another asking for chairs. And every single time, like literally every single time, when they would give me a chair, they would say, "Oh, by the way, this is a chair that your grandfather made." And yes, true, people, when they wanted to buy furniture, in fact, in the Soviet times, I'm not even sure if they had stores for furniture. If they did, it would have been a rarity, maybe like one per bigger city. And so in a smaller town, they would go to the carpenter and he would make those chairs. And so again, when he makes it, in some cases, he would get paid in cash, but more often it's almost like a barter. So my grandfather would make a chair for a neighbor, but then when the time comes, for example, to plant potatoes or to dig potatoes, the neighbors would return the favor and help him. Or when it's time to harvest, I don't know, different fruits or hay, the neighbors would help in exchange. Or sometimes they would pay again with milk or eggs or whatever they have. So that is, again, something that is not accounted in the transactions that go into GDP, but it is production. I mean, they make chairs and they make, poultry and whatever else. And so it is part of wealth creation. Likewise, like seasonal, let's call them neighbor workers. Ukrainians are obsessed with their gardens, and every spring they plant potatoes, and then every fall they dig potatoes, even when they don't have to. In fact, now it seems like most people don't have to do that, but they still do, just because, I don't know, national tradition. And so every time early May, there would be several days off in early May in the Soviet Union and then in Ukraine. My whole family, my parents and I, and my siblings, we would go to the smaller town where my grandparents lived, and we would spend several days planting potatoes, and then do the same thing in the fall, digging those potatoes up. And again, it is work, it is production. In fact, pretty much entire country spends a few days doing that. But again, it's not accounted in this GDP calculation. Same thing with the neighbors. I mean, in many cases, they would literally kind of go house to house. Today we dig person's A's potatoes, and tomorrow the whole neighborhood goes and digs potatoes for somebody else. And so again, nobody counts that. And then again, a lot of help from relatives, a lot of helps, services neighbors offering neighbors. So all of that is production, but it's not counted in GDP. So if you add all of those shadow economy transactions, it would actually seem like the real GDP per capita in Ukraine is probably closer to 8,000 and maybe 9,000. And then if you also account that the prices are much, much lower, then my grandparents could actually afford probably an equivalent of about, let's say, $12,000 US. Now, it is still much less than what Americans can do, but it's more like 1/3, maybe 1/4, but definitely not 1/20th, as it may be suggested by, if you simply look at the GDP per capita numbers and nothing else. So GDP per capita doesn't quite capture all of those intricacies, and so for that reason, it's not necessarily the good measure. Another way to look at it is to compare the so-called GDP per capita with the GDP per capita at the purchasing power parity. Purchasing power parity is essentially a measure of cost of living, let's call it that way. So for example, if we measure purchasing power parity, we have to measure it against some country. And so for example, when we look at the United States in this case, it's used as a base, you will see that the GDP per capita for the United States and GDP per capita at the purchasing power parity are not essentially identical by definition. So that is our base country. And so once you take the American prices as the base, you can then adjust the GDP per capita in each other country by the difference in the cost of living in those countries against the United States. And this way you can see how much more or how much less people there can buy with, let's say, $1 than what they could have bought with $1 in the United States. And you would see some interesting differences. For example, when you look at countries like, let's say, Switzerland. Switzerland is a very rich country, and when you look at the GDP per capita only, it may appear that Switzerland is much richer than the United States. Switzerland has the GDP per capita of 80,000, almost 81,000, whereas the United States has a GDP per capita of only 59,000. So the difference is more than 20,000, or about 25%. So it may seem like the Swiss are 25% more developed, richer than the United States. But then you look at the price of living, cost of living in the United States, and you see that in Switzerland, once you adjust it for the purchasing power parity, the GDP per capita drops to about 59,000. In fact, almost identical to that in the United States, which tells us that Americans can buy as much with the money they make in the United States than the Swiss can buy in Switzerland with more money that they make in Switzerland. Or in other words, if the Swiss took all of the money that they earned and tried to buy some products in Switzerland, they would only be able to buy as much as Americans can buy with their lower American salary. So in a sense, the Americans and the Swiss can afford the same basket of goods with the money they make in their countries, even though in the nominal terms, the Swiss income is about 25% higher. On the other hand, I like the example of Qatar. So Qatar has a GDP per capita that is roughly that of the United States, so almost identical, slightly higher. And Qatar is one of the countries in the Middle East. They have a lot of oil, so they have a lot of a high GDP per capita. But the life in Qatar is much cheaper than in the United States. So the prices in Qatar are much lower, from gas to food to everything else. And so when you adjust the cost of living or adjust the GDP per capita in Qatar by the cost of living in Qatar, which is almost half of what it is in the United States, their income or GDP per capita at the purchasing power parity is twice as high as in the United States. So essentially, they make the same number of dollars if you simply look at those pieces of paper. So they make, let's say, for example, if this were my American salary, right? That's how much I make, and with this money, I can buy, let's say, for example, 1 million pens like this one, right? But then in Qatar, they make exactly the same amount of money, exactly the same number of dollars, but they can buy twice as many pens, because in Qatar, these pens cost, for example, half of what they cost in the United States. And so this way, even though the GDP per capita is the same in Qatar and in the United States, Qataris can afford a basket of goods that is twice as big as that Americans can afford in the United States. Likewise, a good example would be the Czech Republic. Again, Qatar is a special story. They have a lot of oil, and it's a whole different type of economy. But the Czech Republic is actually very similar to the United States in respect, what they do. So it's basically a service economy. They have some factories, they have some services. And when you look at the cost of at the GDP per capita in Czech Republic, it's close to $20,000. So it is 1/3 of that in the United States. So it may look like Americans are 3 times as developed, 3 times as rich. But then again, you look at the cost of living, and in Czech Republic, it's about half of what it is in the United States. So once you adjust for that cost of living in Czech Republic, the GDP per capita at purchasing power parity goes up to about 33,000. Again, they're still not quite as rich as Americans, but what they can buy with their 1/3 salary of the American salary is actually closer to half or even more than half of what Americans can afford. And so that's why when you look at people in, for example, countries like Ukraine, like the Czech Republic, it may look on paper that they're much poorer because their GDP per capita is so much lower. But when you go there, you actually see that they don't really look that different in terms of what they have and how they live. You look at them and they also have houses and they have, something to wear. In fact, their clothing is not that different from what people wear in, for example, Germany or Canada or the United States. Most families have a car, or at least, in the town cities where you have to have one. Most of them probably can go on vacation at the end of the year. They eat roughly the same food. So even though they make much less, but the difference is not that striking. So it's not like they have, houses that are, 1/5 of the size of American houses, or cars that are tiny, and most of them use only bicycles, not cars. No, it's not that different. And so it's important to take that into account. There are obviously very poor countries, like, for example, like South Sudan and Central African Republic. Those are so poor that even if you adjust it for the purchasing power parity, you still, they're still very poor. I mean, it's still a very, very low amount of dollars. But then again, like, let's look at South Sudan, arguably the poorest country in the world. So South Sudan, the GDP per capita is only $221. I mean, in nominal terms, they make about $20 of wealth per month. I mean, that's probably what most Americans make or earn. In fact, not only make, but earn in half an hour. But then again, once you adjust for the very, very low cost of living, that goes up to 1,600. So that goes up with 8 times, right? So it's a huge increase in that, but it's still not a lot of money. So it's still a very small number of dollars, and they can still buy very little with that money. Now, here is a question that would appear on my test if you're taking my course for credit. I'm going to give you a second, read the question, and see if you know the answer. Now, this is a very easy question. It's a definition question. So if the United States is used as a base, then obviously the GDP per capita and the GDP per capita at PPP will be the same. So when we look here at the map, at the chart, here the United States is used as a base. And we see that the GDP per capita and the GDP per capita at purchasing power parity is exactly the same. So the difference is 0. That's the definition. So the correct answer here would be A. Now, there is this very interesting, almost funny index that is called the Big Mac Index. A few researchers from, if I remember correctly, from Harvard came up with this index decades ago, and they have been tracking it for many years now, compiling many years, for many years. It is kind of semi-official, I mean, more of a joke, but it is very illustrative. So what is the Big Mac Index? You know what a Big Mac is, right? It's a burger sold at McDonald's. And what's remarkable about this burger is that it's sold in pretty much every country on this planet. So McDonald's has its restaurants in something like 160 countries out of 187 countries that exist out there. And in most cases, it is basically an identical product, made exactly the same. So it's precisely the same product. And it is made mostly from local ingredients or sourced from nearby. And so as a result, the transportation is not a factor and the import tariffs are not a factor. And so because it's all made locally and it's the same product, you would think that it should cost the same amount or number of dollars or whatever the local currency in different countries. But the truth is that it's not. The prices are different in different countries if you express them in dollars. So for example, in the United States, a Big Mac costs about $5. So for $5, you can buy one Big Mac, right? But then you go to a country like Switzerland, and it's actually about 25% more expensive. You have to pay $6.35 in dollars for a Big Mac. And then you go to countries like, for example, Mexico or Russia, and you can buy one for only $2 or $2.15 to be precise in Russia. which is much, much less than what it would cost in the United States. Now, obviously, the question is why McDonald's charges different prices. Maybe they have some hidden policy. But if we assume that's how much they can afford or how much people can afford to pay for that product, then you have this wonderful, nice way to calculate the different or compare different cost of living in different countries. And so when you look at this index, and again, some people use it to estimate how undervalued or overvalued a different currencies are, or some other ways, to compare countries. But probably the closest way to measure, or the most relevant way to talk about it, is cost of living. And so again, you can see here that an American may be making more money, but an American has to pay 2 or even 3 times as much as, for example, a Mexican or a Russian to buy the same product, which is Big Mac. And so as a result, you can tell that even though Americans make more greenback dollars, it's not necessarily that they can buy much more goods with those dollars. In fact, in some cases, maybe even less once you adjust for the purchasing power parity. And here is a question that is likely to appear on the exam. This one is more complicated, so let's see if you will be able to answer it. So we have country X, where GDP per capita is higher than the GDP per capita at the purchasing power parity. So let's try to find a country like this where GDP per capita is higher than the GDP per capita at the purchasing power parity. Let's look at this table and try to find one where we have this situation. And so, for example, Switzerland would be a good example. The GDP per capita for Switzerland is higher than the GDP per capita at PPP for Switzerland. So essentially, this question would be then for Switzerland, what is true? And the answers are cost of living in country X in Switzerland is higher than in the United States. And we know that is the correct answer. We don't even have to read the rest, right? Because we know that in Switzerland, the cost of living is higher than in the United States. That is your correct answer. Now, there are all kinds of other reasons that we may not necessarily have to look at a GDP per capita as the only or the best measure of economic development. For example, medical cost. Again, in order to live long, we need medical care. And it turns out that the prices of medical care are very, very different in different countries. And so here again, I have an example of how the same drug, the same pill, identical in all respects, how much it costs in different countries. And as you can see, when you compare, for example, Canada, the United Kingdom, Spain, Netherlands, we're not talking about some sort of a third world country. We're talking about countries that are very similar to the United States in the type of economy and the wealth they have. And you see that the difference is actually huge. Like, for example, if you take this last drug, Nexium, I have no idea what it is for. But in Canada, you can buy those pills for $30, whereas in the United States, they will cost you $305, 10 times as much. Or you look at some other prices, and again, you can see that they are 2, 3, 4, 10, 20, 30 times as high in the United States as they are in other developed countries. So again, same thing. Americans may be making a lot of money, but not necessarily can afford to buy much with that money. So GDP per capita wouldn't tell you that. But when you look at the specific prices, you see the difference. Here is another very interesting chart that tells you a little bit more about money. So for example, what people spend the money on. As a famous robber from one of the older movies said, it's not the money that I like, it's what I can buy with the money. And so again, you can have a lot of money, but the question is, what can you afford with it? And again, when you look at the different spending categories, you will see that, for example, Americans earn a lot of money, but they have to spend much, much more in healthcare than just about any other nation on this list. At the same time, for example, Russians spend more than almost a third of their income on food, whereas for Americans, that's only about 7%. And then, for example, South Koreans have to spend a lot on education. Again, in fact, much, much more than any other nation compared to. And so on and so on. Japanese, for example, have to spend a lot on housing. So in fact, quarter of all the income in Japan goes on housing. So housing is expensive, and that's what they have to buy. And so as a result, again, GDP per capita doesn't capture those intricacies, but when you look at these charts, you actually see how life much more complicated is when you deal about these things, or when you talk about these things. And then another very interesting way to look at it is through the point of view of economic inequality. As we said before, you can have a country, let's say, of 10 people with a GDP of $100, in which case everybody essentially has an earning of $10. And they receive $10 and spend that money. So for example, if I have $10 here, that would be everybody's income. And then you can have another country where, again, the GDP per capita is $100 and you have 10 people. But in that country, let's assume the wealth is distributed very unequally. So one person has all the money and the rest of the people have only this little. And so even though on average it's a lot per person, but in reality, everybody has only a very small portion of that wealth. And so that would be one of the interesting indicators of national development. I mean, nobody would argue that everybody in the country should make the same amount of money, of dollars of salary. I mean, obviously, some people are more talented than others. Some people work much harder. Some people are much more determined. Some people take more risk. Some people work longer hours. Some people work smarter. Some people may be, inventing some things that everybody needs. Obviously, there must be differences, and people do different jobs. Maybe some jobs require more responsibility, more diligence. So obviously, nobody would argue that everybody must make the same amount of dollars and have the same wealth. Obviously, somebody has to do better than others. But at some point, the difference becomes so big that it may not be actually very good. And so before we get into what's good and what's bad, let's actually look at how wealth is distributed in different countries. There is this, what they call Inequality Index, Gini. It was invented or first time proposed by an Italian economist, Gini, I don't know his first name. And so the way this index is structured is that if it's 0, then everybody in the country has exactly the same wealth. So unrealistic doesn't exist, but that would be basically indicate that everybody is exactly equally rich. If you have a Gini of 1, that means that one person owns all of the money and then nobody or everybody else owns nothing. And as you can imagine, most countries are somewhere in between. So when you look at the wealth inequality in the world, you will see that probably the most egalitarian country is Japan, or close to that. In Japan, they are a wealthy nation. Obviously, it's not everybody is equally poor. Everybody is actually roughly equally rich. And at the same time, there is not a huge difference between the richest and the poorest. And then when you go and try to find the most unequal countries, you would see that in some African countries and some Latin American countries like Argentina, you would see that they are very unequal. So a few rich people and then very, very few, many very poor people. Surprisingly, the United States is not that remarkable on this list. So the United States is actually a little bit above the average. So meaning that it's a little more unequal than most countries. And I have here some of the indicators for the most recent year. So when you look at the United States, not only it is not a very good indicator anymore, but it is also increasing. So the United States used to be a much more egalitarian society. In fact, if you loan for the times when America was great, like right after the Second World War, at that time it was much more egalitarian. So there was much less difference in how wealth was distributed across the people than it is now. And so if you want to bring the great days again, then one of the things you might want to think about is how do you make people a little bit more equal, as it was in those days when nobody would dispute America's greatness. Is it good or bad? Well, as I said, it's probably bad when everybody has exactly the same amount of wealth. As I told many times, I was born in, at that time, Soviet Union. And in the Soviet Union, it's not that everybody was equal. There were still some people that were more equal than others in the Orwell's words. But everybody was roughly equally poor. And by no means do I want to go back to that system, or would I recommend anyone to go back to the system when everybody is poor unequal in that respect. But there is a very interesting experiment, or there was a very interesting experiment conducted some time ago at Duke and Harvard universities. Duke is right here, just about an hour away. Harvard is a little further away. So they did this very interesting study, and if you want to watch the whole video, it's about 10 minutes. You can click on the link here on the slides, or just type it in, and you can watch a very nice video. But let me talk about how that experiment went. So they did several things. So first, they started asking people what their ideal distribution of wealth in a country would be. So essentially what they did is they asked, in your own kind of perspective, if you could distribute wealth any way you want, how much wealth would you say the top 20% should own? So how much wealth of all the wealth in the country, how much should be owned by the top 20%? So if a person believes in communism, the person would say, well, 20%. So even though they're the richest, they should own the same proportion. And in that case, they should own 20%. As you can imagine, most people didn't believe that, or didn't think that would be a good way forward. Most people said, well, the richest 20% should probably own more than 20%. And so they said, we think it would be fair if the richest 20% owned something like 30%. So they should own more, but not much more. So kind of, be as maybe twice as wealthy as the poorest, and about 50% as wealthier than the average. Then those people were asked, so what do you think the distribution is like in the United States? And to their credit, all of the respondents, or most of the respondents, said, well, it's not really as good as we believe it should be. We believe that in reality, the top 20% actually owns about 60% of the wealth. So they don't own only about 30% as we think it should be, but they own twice as much as we believe the ideal is. So we believe that they own about 60% of all the wealth. And then the researchers actually look at what that number really is. And it's really about 85-90%, meaning that the 20 wealthiest percent of the United States own almost all of the wealth, own close to 90% of all of the wealth. So the point here is that people, when it comes to a political debate, when we have all those fights about becoming too socialist or too little socialism, or if you support Democrats or Republicans. So Democrats always push for more equality. Republicans push for perhaps more pro-business policies that may lead to inequality, and they say it's okay, and many people support them. So we can argue about it all day long, but the point is that when we look at the specific numbers, then first, people actually believe in a system that is very close to that of Japan. So, if you believe that top 20% should own about 30% of the wealth, you basically look at a very socialist system like the Japanese, or perhaps Finland or Norway. So in a sense, people actually want to have a pure socialism like they have in the staple socialist countries. And second, when people try to develop new policies or advocate for policies or elect politicians who would be developing policies, they don't even imagine or cannot even imagine how much unequal this country is, because it is much more unequal than what people believe. And so that's telling to me. So it is important to know what you deal with before you're trying to make some changes. So the video, you can watch it, as I said, using this link here. And for those of you who are taking my course, I will post this video so you can download it directly to Canvas. Now, when you look at the world inequality, it's actually even worse. In fact, last year was 2017, was the year when the top 1% of the world, I'm sorry, it's not worse, but it's actually also quite bad. So last year was the year when on this planet, top 1% started owning more than 50% of the wealth. So if you take all of the people on this planet and you take 1% of those people, they own more than 50% of all the wealth on this planet, all the, houses and goods and, whatever people have, money and cars. So top 1% owns more than half of all the wealth on this planet. Top 10% owns 88% of everything that is on this planet. And the bottom 50%, so like half of, so there are about 8 billion people on the planet right now. So if you take 4 billion, so half of all the poorest people, they own less than 1%. So it's very, very unequal. So Bottom 50% own less than 1%. So you can imagine how much the difference is between the richest and the poorest. If you want to see how you compare it to the rest of the population of this planet, well, if you have wealth that is equal to about $3.6 thousand, so if you take your house, your car, your clothing, the money you have in your pocket, the money that you have in your bank account, and if all of that is equal or more to $3,650, then you are richer than half of the population of this planet. If you add the price of your house, of your car, and everything else that you own, and you get about $77,000, then you are richer than 10% of this population. And if you take all the, your house, car, your wealth, your jewelry, your money, your whatever else you have, and you have about $798,000 in wealth, you are in top 1% of wealth on this planet. So you are basically wealthy. And so what's interesting, actually, many of my neighbors would be in top 1% on this planet. I mean, the houses on the street where I live are $500,000, $600,000. And I imagine some people still don't own it fully, so they're still paying off. But we have some older people who live on the street. I'm pretty sure they have paid off their houses. And if they have some savings on top of that, I imagine that probably would add up to about a 1%, top 1% of wealth on this planet. And I live in a smaller town that is not wealthy by any means. So if you go to towns like New York, like Chicago, it seems to me that many, if not most people, would actually qualify for the top 1%. I mean, obviously, there are many, many people in any town in the United States who own nothing. So they rent an apartment and they live paycheck to paycheck. They may have a car and they may have, I don't know, clothing and maybe some food in the fridge, and that's basically all they own. And so from that perspective, many of them may not even be in top 50%. But, that just to give you some perspective. Now, here is a very interesting exercise or tool, and I wish I had it for more recent years. But let me show you how it works for up until the year that I have. So here what you have is an interactive graph built by someone from the University of Chicago, if I remember correctly, and I'm not sure why they haven't done it for the more recent years. But it shows you the wealth distribution in a country and shows it over time. And so first, let's take a look at how wealth was distributed or has been distributed in the world. So first, we're looking at 1970. So we're looking at about 50 years ago. 50 years ago, most people had or made about, so here we're talking about income, not wealth, not what you own, but how much you make per month. So those are different things, I assume you know. So most of the world 50 years ago made about $1,000 per month. But then there were some richer countries like Europe, like the United States, that made up to $10,000 a month. And then there were even some people who would make closer to $100,000 per month. And almost nobody would make much more. Almost nobody. And this is how it's been changing over time. So as you see, the world is becoming bigger. So there is more people, they make more money together. And the medium moves, the average moves from about $1,000 to more like maybe $5,000, $6,000. So from about $100 per month to probably about more like $500 a month. So it's an adjusted, inflation adjusted numbers. And so as you see, we still see that same division. So you kind of have the developed world here, and then you have kind of middle of the pack, and then you have a lot of poorer countries. And so if I uncheck the world and instead look at specific countries, this is what we'll see. For example, if I take Brazil, right? So what's remarkable about Brazil is that you see this great inequality. So you have a lot of very poor people who make about $1,000 a month, or a year. So about $100 or $80 a month 50 years ago. And then you have many people who make 10 times that much, more like $10,000. And then there is almost nobody in between. So you have almost no middle class. And over time, this is what it's been changing like. So as you see, people became richer and richer and started making more and more, and the population grew as well. So there is more income for the country, but the structure stayed almost the same. So as you see, on average, now people probably make more like $5,000 a year, so maybe $400 or $500 a month. And then there are some people who make more like 50 or whatever this corresponds to. It's a logarithmic scale. As you see, it's 1, 10, 100, right? But then still there is not much middle class. So there are not many people who make something in between. And so when you look at Mexico, it's a similar story. So two kind of like a camel type distribution where you have bimodal distribution, a lot of people who are poor, and then some people who are rich, and almost nobody in between. Then you look at, for example, a country like Japan, and in Japan you would see that it's actually a different story. So in Japan you have a much higher income to start with. Like 50 years, most people made about $10,000, and over time that's how it's been changing. So it's becoming bigger, larger, and now converges at around probably $50,000. And then it's also becoming more egalitarian. So when you look at the distribution 50 years ago, there were different, there was some division between the middle class and the rich and the poor. But over time, with their socialist policies, they actually managed to make it a little bit more egalitarian. So now everybody, I mean, there are still some people who make more and make closer to $100,000, and there are some people who make less than $10,000. But most people seem to be in this kind of healthy middle. And so when we look at the distribution of the United States, it's also unique. So the United States, what's interesting about it, it's very rich. And even 50 years ago, most people, as you see, made about probably closer to $20,000, $30,000 a year. And over time, that's what's been changing like. So first it's been growing, and growing pretty rapidly. And so now it looks like most people make more like $50,000, $60,000. And there are quite a few people who make a lot more than $100,000. But what's remarkable about the American distribution is that they have this kind of a whole group of people that are left behind. It's not a large group, it's probably 25%, but you can see that it's kind of like Brazil or Mexico, but in the other direction. So in Brazil and Mexico, you had a lot of people who are poor, and then some people who are rich, and then almost nobody in between. In the United States, you see the disappearance of the middle class too, but it's not a lot of poor and some rich, it's a lot of relatively rich people, and then almost nobody in between, and then some people who are sort of left behind. So some people who are not making much, and in fact, in today's dollars, make less than 10,000. So basically, live on less than $1,000 a month. And so that's a little strange, and to some extent, it's historic. It is race is a factor here, so you can see definite correlation with race and ethnicity. And I'm not sure if it's good or bad, but there is definitely something to think about. So let me close this graph here, but that's something that I encourage you to look at. Now, another way to look at the wealth of a nation is to look at what they call the Great Gatsby curve. So this one shows a relationship between social mobility and inequality. So some people would say that, just because some people are rich and some people are poor, maybe it's not a problem. Well, it is a problem, and the reason for that is that when you have inequality, you also have low social mobility. So the more unequal the country in terms of the wealth distribution, the harder it is for people from the bottom of the pyramid to break to the top. So, the American dream is, come from nothing, come from, no background or not a noble background, and achieve a lot. And we have a lot of stories. In fact, I have pictures here of people who are basically self-made men. So from Elon Musk to Zuckerberg to Steve Jobs to, all those older people. So obviously, there are many, many wonderful fairy tale stories when somebody, a person from a poor background comes up with an idea, builds a company, and becomes multi-billionaire. We have a lot of those stories, and probably more than most countries. But when you look at how many people change their social status, essentially, so are born poor and die rich, it's not so many. In fact, when you look at the United States, it's actually many fewer than, for example, for Germany, for Sweden, for Finland. So there is a very strong correlation between inequality and social mobility, almost a perfect correlation. And so countries where you have little inequality, like, as I said, Scandinavian countries, some European socialist countries, people there who are born poor actually have a much greater chance of advancing through the social ladder and becoming rich than, for example, in the United States. So ironically and regretfully, in the United States, it seems like the United States has the worst of both worlds. It is unequal. Again, I'm not comparing it to Brazil and Mexico and some other, so-called developing countries. I'm talking here about other developed countries like France, like Germany, like Sweden, like Italy, like the United Kingdom. And so the United States actually seems to be both less equal, so a greater difference between the rich and the poor, and offering fewer opportunities for social mobility. So people who are born poor may not necessarily have an easy time becoming rich, even though the myth is that America is the land of opportunity. And I personally strongly believe it is. I mean, for me, it's been. For me, definitely it has been. But on the bigger, grander scheme of things, it actually seems to be perhaps less a land of opportunities than some countries that many Americans look down upon as socialist countries, at least with respect to the social mobility. So just something that it's important to sort of, acknowledge. And here is a question. Let's see if you've been listening to me. And the correct answer is negative relationship. Lower social mobility means greater inequality, or the other way around. So it's hard to say which one is the cause and which one is the effect. But yes, in countries where people are different in terms of their wealth, it's hard to change your social status. And vice versa, if it is hard to change your social status, you tend to see that division between the wealthy and the poor. Now, here is another very interesting graph that you can use to talk about how developed a nation is. There is a nearly perfect correlation, as you see on this graph, between wealth and the number of hours people work. So the correlation is negative and nearly perfect, meaning that the wealthier the nation, the less the people work. So the more wealth they have, the fewer hours they work per week. In fact, some of the wealthy nations like Norway, like Sweden, they're even talking about moving to a 4-day business week. So working only Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, and Thursday, and have a 3-day weekend, and having only a 6-hour business day, so work day. They haven't made it legal yet, but many companies are moving to that system. So they make a lot of money, and they're feeling that people should have more leisure time. And so normally the correlation is perfectly negative, but as you can see, the United States is a very notable exception. So for the United States, it's actually not true. Americans are rich, but somehow, no matter how much money they make, they actually work longer and longer hours. In fact, today Americans seem to work more than they used to before, even though they're richer. So it is interesting that Americans, it's a culture, I guess, of workaholics. So even though they're rich, they still work a lot. And perhaps maybe that's why they're rich, because they work a lot. But again, some people may say that we work to live, not live to work. And so in the United States, it appears that Americans live to work, whereas their colleagues, counterparts from Sweden, from Finland, from France, prefer to live to work. To work to live. A more direct measure of how all that wealth is used is what we call the Human Development Index. Human Development Index takes into account not how much, or is not based on how much people produce, but what people do with it. So it looks at things like life expectancy. So how much people are expected to live, how many hours they work. Again, presumably, you're better off when you work a little less and have a little bit more time for your family, for your hobbies, for your leisure. How easy is your access to education, to healthcare? How is your literacy rate? So basically, they look at all the things that money presumably is, designed to buy, and they look at how people can afford it, how much access to all those goodies they have. And so when you look at the Human Development Index, you will see that, yes, as expected, America, Canada, Europe, Japan are doing all pretty well. So the United States is not number one. So the Scandinavians, Australia, Switzerland actually do better. And I here provide only some examples. So the United States is number 10, right, tied up with Canada. So what that tells us that even though Americans make more in terms of the dollars, so the GDP per capita is higher, when it comes to buying things that matter to humans, as I said, from social to healthcare to education to how long they live, the United States is still doing extremely well. So nothing to complain about. Out of 187 countries, the United States is number 10, so which is quite abnormal. But at the same time, as I said, when we sometimes make fun of those socialists, like Scandinavians or even Canadians, it's kind of worthwhile to remember that they actually seem to have at least they score higher on the Human Development Index. So they seem to have a more human suitable type of life, if I can put it in those words. And then, as you probably can imagine, that the poorest countries on this, or the worst performing countries on this index, are countries like Yemen, like Niger. China is doing relatively okay, but again, much lower than, for example, the so-called developed countries. So again, a very good way to look at how nations are developed compared one compared to another. And then some people say, well, why should we even look at wealth and production and healthcare and all those things? Why not look at, for example, happiness? In fact, Dalai Lama was one of the speakers at the Davos World Forum 10 years ago, something like that. And so he was the one who said, well, who told you that a bigger house is bigger? Who told you that a trip to a museum or, I don't know, a theater is a good thing? What if somebody just wants to sit on a beach all day and do nothing? Or maybe, I don't know, work in a garden, or I don't know, hunt animals on the prairies somewhere in Africa? Who told you that your life is better just because you have things and they don't? Maybe it's ultimately all about happiness. Maybe it's all about, where people are happiest. And on that dimension, again, the scientists decided to rank the countries. And so what they did is they literally just looked at how happy people feel in different countries. And so the way they measured it, they literally just asked them. So there is this scale that is called subjective well-being, and they asked, how happy do you feel? And not surprisingly, people who have a relatively wealthy life feel happier. So no matter what somebody tells you, that children in Africa are happier than children in the United States, well, according to those studies, it's not true. It seems like Africa is the least happy country, and then Middle East is not very happy. My native Ukraine appears not very happy, and clearly you can say that those countries are not very rich. But then countries that have a lot of wealth, like Europe, like the United States, like Australia, tend to be happier. But then again, the correlation between happiness and wealth is not perfect. If you will look at the map here, you will see that, for example, again, Scandinavians are the happiest. So Sweden is actually one of the happiest countries. In fact, the happiest country. Iceland is one of the happiest countries. And they are not as rich as, for example, Americans. In fact, Canadians are happier than Americans. Like literally, Canadians are not as wealthy, but happier than Americans. And so go figure, maybe it's not all about GDP per capita, maybe it's not all about money. So it's important to remember that as well. All right, here is a question for you. So see if you can answer it. And the answer obviously is, well, none of these measures is a perfect measure of national development. So as we discussed, all of them seem good at the first glance, but once you think about that, you understand that no, probably it's not enough. GDP per capita, GNP per capita, GDP per capita, PPP, Gini, even HDI, Human Development Index, don't really tell you the complete story. So maybe there is more to measuring happiness, to measuring national development, and that was the whole point of this lecture. Here is a list of things that you need to know on the exam, some definitions, some understanding, and I would like to tell you that I will not be testing on the exam the specific statistics, so you don't need to know the precise American GDP per capita or Gini index, but you need to know the trends. You need to know how different countries compare to one another, which countries are wealthier, which countries are happier, which countries score higher on, for example, HDI or Gini, but you don't need to know the specific numbers. And this is where the lecture concludes. Thank you so much for your attention, and I will see you in next lecture. Thank you so much.